great pleasure to be here, and I think that as Professor Marchant has mentioned that, I mean, our focus is on Concord, so his focus is on Antarctic, and he works lots of places, but our focus is really on Concord. And this project really began about 13 years ago, because when I was revising my textbook 13 years ago, the section on climate change had really changed. So when I first wrote a textbook in 1992, climate change was just kind of a theory or an idea that some scientists had. It was very speculative, but by 2002, it had gone from being kind of a short section of my book, which was very speculative, and by 2012, or 2002, this had become like a whole subchapter on climate change with lots of evidence just showing that there was a reality to climate change. But what I noticed in 2002 was that all the examples were from faraway places. They were like polar bears in Canada, it was wildflowers in the Swiss Alps, frogs in the mountains of Costa Rica. All the examples were from far away. And I wondered, why don't we have any examples from the eastern United States, or from the United States generally, or the lower 48 states? And also in 2002, President Bush was still president, and he was very skeptical of climate change and said that this was just kind of a contending theories of different scientists. And until we really know about the reality of climate change, we didn't have to do anything. Let the scientists sort of resolve it first. And this always struck me as being kind of strange, because even 13 years ago, most scientists were convinced that climate change was actually happening. So in 2002, I decided to completely stop all the research which I was doing on tropical ecology. So every summer, I would go up with my students to Southeast Asia, to the island of Borneo, and we would look at the effects of logging on tropical forests. And in 2002, I decided to completely stop that and start looking at climate change. And what I'm going to tell you about right now is sort of what we found out about climate change. So what we found out, and also our orientation is a little bit different for most scientists. So most scientists, they try to do the best research possible and publish it in peer-reviewed journals. But our goal right from the beginning was to do the best possible research, but to make the research very widely available to the American public, and to try to tell the American public what we had found out about the reality of climate change in the eastern United States. And it turned out that if you're going to look for the effects of climate change, there's probably no place better than Boston, Massachusetts for looking at the effects of climate change. And one of the reasons why it's such a great place is because we've had so much warming in the Boston area. We've had warming not only because of global warming of about 0.7 degrees centigrade, or about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, but we've also had a lot of warming because of urbanization. And we also have great records in Boston. We also have one of the longest running weather stations in the United States, maybe the oldest running weather station at Blue Hills. And this shows the warming trend that we have in the Boston area. And so we have extremely variable weather in Boston, but the trend is clearly toward warming temperatures. So we have, this is just showing the temperatures in the months of March and April, starting from the 1850s, when the very famous environmental philosopher Henry David Thoreau was active. And we already had warming by the turn of the century, when there was another botanist who was very active named Hosmer in the Boston area. And then kind of, again, very variable temperatures, but on up until the present time. So this is in degrees centigrade here. So this is roughly about 36 degrees Fahrenheit. And we have an increase of about 3 degrees. So from about 36 degrees Fahrenheit to about sort of the low 40s Fahrenheit in the months of March and April. And again, you can see there's very variable temperatures, but a trend toward increasing temperatures. Then we had this incredibly warm year of 2010. I thought I would never see a warm year like that ever again in my lifetime, because it was just so record-breakingly warm in the New England area. And then in 2012, we had another sort of record-breaking warm year across the United States. So we not only are having a warming trend, but we're also breaking a lot of records for warm temperatures. So in our research, we really focus on temperatures, the fact that the temperatures are rising, but also, as you may know, that New England is also getting wetter. At the same time, the western United States is getting drier over a large region. New England is actually getting wetter in terms of temperature. Sea levels are rising in this area, so the sea levels have risen by about 8 inches in the New England area over the last 100 years. And also CO2 levels are rising. So we've gone from 270 parts per million to 400 parts per million over the last few hundred years. And it's quite probable that biological systems are also responding to these higher CO2 levels. So a lot of plants, CO2 is often limiting, and the fact that we have more CO2 means some plants are going to do better, and maybe some plants will do worse. So the physical environment is changing, and you all, I think you all know this, the class knows it. The reason the temperature is changing is because we're producing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because of burning of fossil fuels and cutting down tropical rainforests. And the CO2 acts as a blanket, and it's like putting more blankets on your bed at night. So eventually at some point you wake up at night and you're sweating and you're screaming because it's so hot. And that's what the world is doing right now. It's getting hotter because of all these extra blankets of CO2 we're putting. But we're biologists, so we're interested in the biological effects of this warming temperatures. And we're particularly interested in how the warming temperatures have affected the biological diversity of the New England area, how it's affecting the plants and animals in the forests. The second question is sort of why should we care about it? I'm a native New Englander, so I think I can say this, that the idea of a slightly warmer climate and earlier spring is kind of appealing. It's kind of nice to have a warmer climate, but there are consequences to this warmer climate. So it means that a lot of wetlands are going to dry out, and a lot of the endangered animals and plants of our wetlands are going to die out. The forests are going to start dying because of greater outbreaks of insect pests. It also means heat waves in the cities, so a lot of public health consequences, more days in which it's above 90 or 95 degrees, with a lot of consequences to people in our cities. And also rising sea levels. So as long as it keeps getting warmer, the polar ice caps and the glaciers are going to keep melting, and the sea level is going to rise, making Boston ever more vulnerable to flooding. So in this whole area where the BU campus is, the whole Back Bay and South Boston areas of Cambridge and Somerville, these areas are all filled in tidal marshes. And if we get hit by a big hurricane like Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Katrina during a time of natural high tide, Boston will be underwater. Just the same way that New Orleans and New York City were underwater when they were hit by hurricanes, we will be underwater also. And we're ever more vulnerable to this type of massive damage as the sea level continues to rise. And then the third question is, what are we going to do about it? Most scientists, in my experience, maybe Professor Marchant will confirm this, most scientists are quite content to just do very technical research and publish it in peer-reviewed journals that basically nobody reads or very few people read. But I think that scientists have a responsibility to try to take the research that they're doing, which is very relevant to social concerns, and make it more widely known. And so what we do in our research group is that we try to reach a very wide audience as much as possible through the scientific research we're doing. We try to write popular articles. We talk to school groups. I don't turn down any invitation from any school group that wants me to come there. I recently accepted an invitation to talk to an elementary school of fourth graders, about an hour away. And why did I accept it? I accepted it because I accept every invitation to try to talk to the public about climate change and also to write articles about climate change. And of all the indicators that we have of the biological effects of climate change, the one that we have the most information about is phenology. So phenology is the timing of biological events, and many biological events are sensitive to temperature. So presumably if we found information related to past flowering time, we could track the effects of climate change. Another indicator of climate change is the distribution of species, and in particular, some species like birds and butterflies are very sensitive to temperature, and they can move very actively across the landscape. And so if conditions get warmer or colder, they can change their distribution accordingly. And the third indicator, the one which is harder to work with, is the changing abundance of species. So some species like warm weather, and some species like cold weather. So as the temperature changes, we might expect to see a shift in the abundance of individual species. So the challenge that we faced a dozen years ago was trying to find old records. So the ideal is that you find someone that has old records of, for example, when things were happening, the timing events in the past, and match them with modern records, and you can see the fingerprints of climate change. And when we started this work a dozen years ago, we had no idea if we would find any such old records. Actually, many of my colleagues told me that not only we wouldn't find any old records, but even if we found them, we would never get funding to do it, that the research wouldn't be very interesting, and people discouraged me from doing it. But a dozen years ago, myself and my graduate students and various undergraduates did a very intensive search for across the whole metropolitan Boston area to try to find any old records. So we went to libraries, we went to universities, I got up at all the meetings. We have a huge number of small natural history clubs in the Boston area, bird clubs and butterfly clubs and plant clubs, and we just started asking people about old records. We actually went around Boston at one point putting up notices in supermarkets and public libraries. We wrote notices in listservs. I started emailing hundreds of people, sometimes strangers, asking if they had any old records or knew about records. And what we found was that there was in fact a huge amount of records in the Boston area. That the Boston area, because it has this long academic tradition, it's a very educated city, that there were in fact huge amounts of records that were out there. And of all the records that were the most exciting were the records that were gathered by Henry David Thoreau in the 1850s. So in the 1850s, mostly from 1851 to 1858, Henry David Thoreau, the famous environmental philosopher who wrote Walden, who wrote Civil Disobedience, he kept very detailed records of when plants were flowering and many other natural history phenomenon in Concord. And these records were in the Morgan Library in New York City. And when we found out about them, we were amazed. And it turned out that I had a lot of friends who were Thoreau scholars, who were kind of English professors or philosophy professors. And they were amazed that we didn't know about them, that biologists didn't know about these records, because these are well known to English scholars and history scholars, philosophers, but they were not known to biologists. And as soon as I saw these records, I knew that they were incredibly valuable for climate change research. And this is an example of Thoreau's records that we got a photocopy of his records. And they're just these beautiful tables, unpublished tables and again, the originals are at the Morgan Library. And these records were extracted by Thoreau from his journal. So in his journals, he kept daily journals where he would write down when he would first see plants flowering and other natural history phenomenon, and then he would extract them out sort of year by year. And this was one of his records from 1857, and this is one page. So this is a page from May of 1857. These are dates, so May 14th, and these are the plants that he saw the first open flower of these species in the spring. And first of all, you notice that his writing is in black and my writing is in blue. And the first thing you notice is that he had really bad handwriting. He had bad handwriting, and also he changed over. He started off using common names, and then he changed over to scientific names, and his names are often different from the names we use today. But some of them are similar. So for example, this one right here, this is high bush blueberry. And this one right here, a little bit more challenging, this is V. vacillans. And you have to be a botanist to know that V. vacillans is Vaccinium vacillans, or the low bush blueberry. So I taught a lot of students to read Thoreau's handwriting, but in the end, I wound up having to do a lot of the work because, I would know the scientific name. So for example, I would look at that and I would say, oh, that's Andromeda polifolia, because I knew that scientific name already. So this was a challenge of sort of getting his names and extracting the data and putting it into Excel spreadsheets. And then our next activity was to go out into Concord starting in 2004 and start recording the first flowering time of plants in the same way that Thoreau did. So Thoreau went out in the spring and he looked for the first flowers of rhodora, a kind of azalea, native azalea, or the bird's foot violet. And also we found that there was another botanist named Alfred Hosmer who from 1878 to 1902 did the exact same thing, was also recording the first flowering times of plants in Concord. His records are in the Concord Public Library. So we did this for a while, and then we started to get our results. I should also mention that as we did this, we also realized that we should focus on the common wildflower species that Thoreau, Hosmer, and ourselves saw in every year. So we would focus on common species that we all saw that were easy to identify, and also that flowered in the spring when plants are really very responsive to temperature. And these are our results. And I always sort of pause when I show this picture because you just can't imagine how much work it takes to make this one simple figure. So this figure, it looks pretty simple, We have dates, dates from Thoreau's time to the present time on this axis, and these are dates in the spring when plants are flowering in Concord. Looks like a pretty simple figure, but I mean, the amount of work it took to get all these records and put them in spreadsheets and match the names, and then the amount of field work that this represents here. So this is a dozen years of field work in Concord, I mean hard field work, and it's just one simple table. And what it tells you is that in Thoreau's time, there's a lot of variation in terms of when plants flower, but they flower on average around May 15th. Some years earlier and some years later. In Hosmer's time, again, a lot of variation, but plants are flowering around May 11th. And in our present years, again, a lot of variation, and this is again 2010 and 2012, but on average plants are flowering around May 5th. So you go to Concord today, it looks very idyllic. It looks like a typical New England town that's just the same way maybe it looked like a couple of hundred years ago, but in fact it's responding to climate change. So temperatures have gotten warmer in Concord, and plants are now flowering about 11 days earlier than they did in Thoreau's time. And plants are responding in Concord to temperature. So instead of putting it in terms of changes over time, if we had put this in terms of flowering time in relationship to spring temperature, temperatures in the months of March and April, you would see that the plants fell along a perfect line. That plants flower really early in warm years, and they flower really late in cold years. And in Thoreau's time, there were a lot of cold years. It was much colder than it is at the present time, and plants flowered really late. And our years are much warmer, and plants are flowering really early. The other thing which is different from our research from a lot of other scientists is that we've written many papers now about these data sets. And whenever we write a paper, we always work with the BU press office, and we write a press release, and then we go and we start pitching it to journalists and people in the media. And every time we've written a paper, it's always been picked up by the Boston Globe, the New York Times, National Public Radio, because it connects climate change to Thoreau and Walden. So it connects climate change to something that people know about and are interested in. Now, not every scientific study is going to get covered in the New York Times, but it's really kind of striking that sometimes when I meet scientists at BU and elsewhere who are doing really interesting research, I tell them they should pitch it to journalists, and they usually just tell me they're too busy. And I'm busy too. I think Professor Marchant is busy also, but I think it's important to take the time to kind of get the message out there. So we're constantly finding kind of new ways of telling the story of climate change. And another example of how we tell the story of climate change is that the Arnold Arboretum right near here is one of the oldest, it's the oldest arboretum in the United States. They have a wonderful collection, and we were working there for a couple of years to just monitor when the collection was flowering. And then one of the staff members just mentioned, oh, why don't you look at the museum that we have here? And it turns out the Arnold Arboretum, which has all these public gardens, also has a private museum where they have 100,000 museum specimens collected on the grounds of the Arnold Arboretum. And when we heard this, we were just amazed because we realized that we could take these museum specimens that were often collected when the plants were in full flower. So for example, this specimen was collected in 1938, on May 19th, 1938. This is a Vaseized azalea, and it was collected from this exact same plant, which is still alive on the grounds today. And so by matching hundreds of these old museum specimens with when the exact same individuals are still flowering on the grounds, you can again see the effects of climate change. So this was collected on May 19th, 1938, and this photograph of the plant in the same condition was taken on May 3rd, 2010. And so by matching hundreds of these observations with hundreds of these museum specimens, we can again see that this botanical garden is responding to climate change. And it's a way of reaching another audience, a group of people who are interested in horticulture and gardening, and they can see that climate change is affecting what they're interested in. The other thing I want to mention is that we have 500 versions of this picture. So we realized that this was we were looking for the most beautiful plant at the Arnold Arboretum. And I think that this is the most beautiful plant at the Arnold Arboretum. And it has a really nice herbarium specimen. And so we went out there one day actually went out there over several days under different lighting conditions. And we took 500 versions of this picture. And this is the version that we like the best. And what happens is that whenever a journalist comes to talk to us about our research, we can give them pictures like this, and they're more likely to write an article about our story because they have great graphics, the great photographs to go with their story. And we've even actually had the case where journalists have come out planning to write an article about somebody else's research, but we have better photographs. So they wind up writing about our research rather than the original person who they were going to cover because we have such good photographs. And again, this is something that scientists often don't take the time to do. So many times I've contacted scientists to get photographs from my textbook about their research, and they don't have any photographs about them actually doing the research. So they have nice graphs and figures, line drawings, but they don't have photographs of them like holding the penguin and putting a radio transmitter on the penguin. And that's the picture that we want in our book, not a table or a line drawing. We want a picture of a scientist holding that penguin, and they often don't have that picture. So we spent a lot of our time looking at flowering time, but then at one point we switched over to looking at leafing out times. And when we made that change to looking at leafing out times of trees and shrubs, we made a whole new group of friends at Boston University and elsewhere among scientists who are interested in ecosystem processes. So scientists who are interested in when trees start leafing out and start building up biomass and making new wood and absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And in particular, a lot of people at BU who do remote sensing. And when we started looking at leafing out in the field, all the people who were doing remote sensing suddenly became our friends because they wanted people who were doing ground truthing of leafing out times, something which is comparable to what they're doing using remote sensing. And what we found was that Thoreau also recorded the leafing out time of trees, and that when you go to Concord and you record the leafing out time of the same species that he did, that plants are now leafing out about 10 days to 2 weeks earlier in Concord than they did in the past. We've also found that photographs are a very interesting record of when plants are leafing out. And one example of how photographs can be very useful in climate change research, we met a woman one time after one of our public talks who told us that she had a very specialized hobby, that she collected stereoscopic photographs, so paired photographs that you can use for 3D images, that she collected photographs from historically important cemeteries on Memorial Day. Very specialized hobby. And she said that of all the hundreds of photographs that she had from photographs around the United States, the eastern United States, taken on Memorial Day or May 30th, that one photograph looked really different. And so she showed us this. So this is one of the pair. And this was taken on May 30th, 1868 at the Lowell Cemetery. And she said it looks different from all her other photographs. And what looks different about it? The trees are bare. So it was taken on May 30th, and the trees don't have any leaves. This photograph on the right is a similar view of the cemetery. You can't take exactly the same view because there's now a building where the person was standing, but it's as close as you can get. But the trees are obviously fully leafed out on May 30th. And it turns out when you look at the weather records for 1868, that this was a year with no spring, that there were actually hard frost, temperatures well below freezing in the months of March, April, May, and even into June. So either the trees never leafed out, or because it was so cold, or they started to leaf out and the leaves were killed by frost. So in Thoreau's time, or during the middle of the 19th century, people were very concerned with cold weather. If the temperatures got just a little bit colder at that time, agriculture would have failed in New England. And now we're concerned with a different situation. If the temperatures just get a few degrees warmer, it's going to have devastating impacts on the world, particularly the rising sea level, the flooding of so many areas, and many areas of the world being too hot for agriculture. Just a small anecdote here is that when we published the results of our research, it was actually covered in the New York Times. So these photographs were actually in the New York Times. And there was actually a group of climate change deniers from the Boston area who organized themselves to disprove this example. So they actually were taking a lot of effort to track down each element of our story to see if they could disprove it. So for example, this photograph wasn't really taken on May 30th, 1868. Maybe the weather wasn't so cold. Maybe that this was really caused by insect damage. And so there was a week when we were really worried that they were going to discover some problem of our story. But in the end, I mean, the story proved to be true, at least as far as they could determine. They couldn't disprove it. We've also increasingly gotten involved in experimental work. So in the past, we mostly did observations, but particularly we found that leafing out lent itself very well to experimental work. And so what we've been doing for the last number of years is we go out in the months of January, February, and March when the trees don't have leaves, when the twigs are dormant, the trees are dormant, and we collect dormant twigs, we cut them, we put them in Dunkin' Donuts cups with a moderate amount of water, and then we see whether they leaf out or not. And what plants have some mechanisms to determine when to leaf out in the spring. They have what's called the winter chilling requirement. They have to go through a certain period of cold weather. They often have a photo period requirement, and then they need to experience some warming in the spring. But people haven't done broad-scale surveys with large numbers of wild species to see what different plant species use to detect the when to leaf out. And so we did this for a large number of species that Thoreau had also observed in Concord. And what we found, there was a really interesting result of this. We found that the native species, so the native New Englanders, perhaps a little bit like myself, were kind of conservative, and they really had to experience several months of winter. They had to experience a long winter before they could respond to warming in the spring. The contrast was that the non-native invasive species, the species like bittersweet, the non-native honeysuckles, multiflora rose, a lot of the non-native species, they were able to respond very quickly to warming, even in January and February. So they were risk takers, that when it was warm, they started to respond quickly, started to leaf out, and when it was a warm spring, they would really get a jump on the native species, and that was one of the reasons why they were so successful. This is actually kind of a demonstration of this graphically. So if you look at just 4 typical native tree species in this area, and you bring them in January, only one of them leafs out. If you look at the native shrubs, out of 4 common native shrubs here, 2 of the 4 will leaf out if you bring them in January. But if you look at the non-native invasive shrubs, 3 of the 4 species will leaf out if you bring them in January. So again, these non-native invasive shrubs are much more likely to respond to warming temperatures. We've also gotten involved with a lot of ornithologists in our research. And we've also tried to determine whether birds are also responding to climate change. And what we find is that there's actually an enormous amount of bird data out there. We actually still haven't finished analyzing all the bird data out there. But what we find in our studies is that birds in general are not responding as strongly as plants to warming temperatures. So a few bird species like the catbird that overwinter in the mid-Atlantic states or the southeastern United States are arriving a couple of days earlier now than in Thoreau's time. And so they are responding, but not as much as the plants. And the birds that are overwintering in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America are not arriving any earlier at all because they don't know what the temperature is like in New England during the spring. So they're setting off at the same time. And so when the birds arrive in the spring, they are eating insects, and insects are really the missing link in this story. So when the birds arrive in the spring, they eat insects, and the insects in turn, when they emerge in the spring, they're feeding on plants. So if we really want to understand the connection between birds and plants, it's really these insects that are the connecting link. And what we find is that insects also respond to warming temperatures just like the plants. When it's really warm, they come out early, and when it's cold, they come out late. And so there is an interesting possibility that if birds aren't responding to climate change, they're not responding to warming temperatures, but the insects and the plants are, that there's a potential for what is called an ecological mismatch. The birds might, in a very warm year, might arrive late in New England after the plants have leafed out, after the insects have become really abundant, and that the birds will miss the first big flush of insects in the spring, and they won't have enough insects to feed themselves, and they won't have enough insects to feed their nestlings. And so a lot of ecologists right now are trying to determine whether these ecological mismatches might be causing some of the observed decline in bird populations. Whenever you do field work, you always discover something surprising, something unexpected. And for us, one thing which was really quite unexpected in our research was that when we went out looking for the first flowering times of plants in Concord, there were so many plant species that Thoreau was looking at and observing that we couldn't find. And this became kind of a major focus of our research, was we would ask the local naturalists in Concord where we could find certain plants. And eventually we concluded that about 27% of the wildflower species that Thoreau had seen in Concord no longer occur there anymore, and about another third of the plant species have declined dramatically in abundance. So this is quite a surprising finding, considering the fact that about 30% of Concord is very strongly protected in conservation areas, and about another 30% of Concord remains undeveloped. So even though the great majority of Concord is still in a fairly natural condition, so many of the wildflower species have declined and gone extinct. An example is the orchid. Some groups in particular have suffered massive loss. So in Thoreau's time, there were 21 species of orchids, and we were only able to find 7 of those species in Concord today. And one of the species is the purple fringed orchid. And this is a photograph of the one orchid we found of this species. So this was a species in Thoreau's time that was very common in the river meadows. And we found one individual in 1 year, this one right here. And after that 1 year, we never saw it again. So this very, very dramatic decline of certain groups like orchids and lilies. And what could be causing that? Some of the answers are, some of the causes of the decline of wildflowers in Concord are pretty obvious. So there are things like habitat destruction, fragmentation by roads, deer populations, invasive species, air pollution and water pollution. But one factor which did stand out in our analysis was also a warming climate. And we know this because if you actually divide up all the species in terms of species that are increasing and decreasing, that the cold-loving northern species, which are mostly found north of Concord, are the species which tend to be declining in Concord. And the species which are mostly the southern warm-loving species, those are the species which tend to be increasing. And also the invasive species are increasing. So this tells us that climate change is at least partially responsible for the loss of wildflower species in Concord. And what is the future of Concord? What is the future of Massachusetts in terms of its flora? Well, if we look at the climate change projections, the temperature projections made by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they've kind of estimated various scenarios for the year 2100, kind of a medium emissions scenario and a high carbon dioxide emissions scenario. And we're actually probably closer on track to this higher emissions scenario at the present time. So it's quite likely that we'll have about a 3°C increase in temperature by the end of this century, unless something pretty radical is done to limit carbon dioxide emissions. And what that means for the climate of Massachusetts is that the climate of Massachusetts will increasingly be like places further to the south of Massachusetts. So when I was growing up, when I was a college student, like about your ages, when I was a college student, Massachusetts had a climate like Massachusetts, right? So Massachusetts used to have a climate like Massachusetts, but Massachusetts no longer has a climate like Massachusetts. Massachusetts presently has a climate like New York City or New Jersey. So we don't have a climate like Massachusetts anymore. We presently have a climate like New York City. And by the end of this century, Massachusetts will have a climate like coastal North Carolina. And I'm not sure if any of you have ever spent much time in coastal North Carolina. Anybody coastal North Carolina? Pretty hot there, huh, in the summertime? Not so pleasant, right? So Massachusetts is going to have a climate that's going to be hot and humid like coastal North Carolina, almost unbearable to be outside during the summertime. And that's what our future is like. So our climate is going to change so dramatically by this by the end of the century. And this area of North Carolina is a very famous area botanically. This is the one area in the United States where the Venus flytrap lives in the wild. And this is an endangered species, very closely protected by the government. And by the end of the century, North Carolina is going to be too hot and too dry, or the coastal area is going to be too hot and too dry for the Venus flytrap. And so where is the Venus flytrap going to live at the end of the century? What's the best place going to be for it at the end of the century? Massachusetts, that's right. So Massachusetts is the future of the Venus flytrap, which presently occurs on the Carolina coastal plain. But the Venus flytrap, for those of you who've seen it in the wild, it's a small plant, and its seeds just fall on the ground. There's no way that plant is going to migrate to Massachusetts in the next 100 years. It just doesn't have that dispersal ability to track a climate which is changing so rapidly. If the climate changed over a couple of thousand years, it could get to Massachusetts, but it's not going to get there in 100 years. So it's going to decline and go extinct in North Carolina, and it's not going to get to Massachusetts if we don't do anything about it. But scientists are increasingly considering something which is called assisted migration or assisted colonization, whereby scientists identify endangered species which have no potential to become invasive and help them to migrate further north or higher up on mountains to be in the same places that they are suited to based on their present distribution. So scientists are considering taking the seeds or plants of the Venus flytrap and bringing them at least temporarily to places like New Jersey or Maryland, and then eventually by the end of the century having places in Massachusetts where they could potentially grow. So particularly areas of Cape Cod, savannas on Cape Cod, might be very suited to this species. The other thing that we're doing right now in our research group is increasingly focusing on autumn. So the autumn season has been comparatively neglected by climate change scientists. So most scientists, biologists who work on climate change, work in the spring, because in the spring kind of things happen very suddenly, very dramatically. There's a lot of the change is driven by temperature. And the autumn is a very exciting time also. The autumn is extending. We can actually see that if we look outside today, that we've had a very mild autumn so far with, as a result of this, the trees are being held, the leaves are being held on the trees longer. Birds are staying around longer before they migrate. Insects are active longer. And this is something which is now, many biologists are concentrating on the autumn season. It's also much more complicated because the autumn season is not just affected by temperature, it's affected by rainfall and photoperiod and frost events. So, but it's something that's been comparatively neglected, and this is really where we're focusing a lot of our research at the present time. One of the most exciting opportunities actually is represented by the interaction between birds and fruit, because the birds are staying later in the autumn because it's very mild, but the native species that have fruits on them, things like blueberries and huckleberries and wild cherries, they're still fruiting at the same time, and birds eat almost exclusively fruit in the autumn. So if the birds are staying longer and the plants that have all these fruits on them are still fruiting at the same time and all get eaten up, what are the birds eating right around this time of the year, late October and November, while they're still around? And what we think the birds are doing is that they're eating the fruits of the non-native invasive species. So all these things, again, like bittersweets and honeysuckles, privets, barberries. So all these non-native invasive species that are really just taking over a lot of the New England landscape. One of the reasons they're successful is because the birds are all eating their fruits in the autumn, and the reason the birds can stay around longer is because they have fruits to eat. And so every year there's more of these invasive plants, and the birds can stay longer because they have more of a food source. So they're sort of facilitating each other in a way which is actually not very good for the New England landscape. The other thing I want to mention, the last thing I wanted to mention, is that we're constantly trying to find a way of telling the story of climate change to a wider audience. And so we've also started to get involved in analyzing sporting events, because not everyone likes flowers and birds. There's a few people out there who have different interests. And so a lot of people out there are interested in sports. And so we have started to analyze sporting events from the perspective of climate change. And one event that we have in the Boston area, which is so amazing, is the Boston Marathon. And so you can analyze the Boston Marathon from the perspective of climate change. And when you analyze all the records that we have, the many decades of records of the Boston Marathon, and you look at the winning times of the races, you find that the winning times, the record-breaking races, are always when the conditions are very cold and when there's a tailwind. So runners run much faster when it's very warm, and when the temperatures are over about 60 degrees, they run slower, and when the temperatures are over 70 degrees, they run really slowly. So, but most of the records are broken when the temperatures are under 40 degrees. And also, they run also faster when there's a tailwind blowing them toward the finish line. But it's actually temperature is the single most important environmental variable. Of course, the race is faster every year as we have more runners, as the training gets better. But within that general trend toward faster races, the records are broken mostly in the very cold years, and the warm years tend to be slow years. And what we find is that when we actually model the future temperature of Boston, what we find is that it's very unlikely there will be records broken in the future. It's because increasingly we'll have race days where the temperatures are over 60 or 70 degrees, and as a result, the conditions will just get too hot for the runners to actually break records on the day of the race. So whenever we whenever I talk about climate change, whenever I write articles about climate change, I always try to relate it to Thoreau, because Thoreau is someone that people know about. A lot of people have read his book Walden. They've read his writings. And so I think it's a way of sort of getting the message of climate change out there. And if you read Walden, I mean, a lot of the important messages in Walden are actually the same messages that you would tell people if they were interested in doing something about climate change. So the first thing is that Thoreau tells us to do in Walden, the first thing he's doing is observing nature very carefully. And if you want to see the effects of climate change yourself, and if you want to get people involved in climate change, what we find is one of the best things to do is to just go out and observe nature in a very careful way year after year and keep a diary. So probably some of you are moving around right now, you were students, but whenever you find that you're in a permanent place and you're going to be in a place for a while, start keeping a diary of when plants flower, when things leaf out, start keeping a record of animals migrating, when we first see the butterfly. Start keeping a record if you're in a place that has a very seasonal climate, start recording the temperatures or the rainfall patterns. And what you will do is if you go out and observe nature very carefully, you will start to see patterns. You will start to see there are differences between years that relate to the climate, and that the climate is changing in a certain way over time. And in Thoreau's case, Thoreau went out and observed the variation from year to year in Concord, but now you can go out and observe nature and you will see a gradual change over time because of a changing climate. The second thing that Thoreau really emphasizes in his book is the need to live simply. And he argued that we need to live simply for a lot of reasons. He argued if we live very simply, that we'll lead a healthier life, we won't have to work as much, we won't be as dependent upon other people, and that our lives will be happier in the end for having a simpler life with fewer cares. And this is actually the same thing we need to the same things we need to do ourselves in terms of having a simpler life to deal with climate change. If each one of us drove a smaller car, lived in a smaller house, kept the thermostat down, had less material possessions, then the United States would be consuming less fossil fuels, and we would contribute less to climate change. So this is kind of a message that he was conveying about his personal lifestyle and his circumstances, but it's the same message we need to do both individually and as a society to deal with climate change. And then the third thing that Thoreau is very involved in, not so much in the Walden, but in other of his writings, is the need to get involved in social issues of the time. So Thoreau was naturally kind of a cranky person. He was kind of a loner. He didn't like people very much, but he felt that he had to get involved in the issues of his time. And his issues, the issues of his time, were fighting against war and stopping slavery. So these were very important issues, and he recognized that if he wanted to deal with these issues of war and slavery, he had to become involved in the political process. So he very actively spoke about these issues at public meetings, he wrote letters, and he was very active in the organizations of his time. And this is something that we also need to be concerned about. We can't just focus on, as individuals, dealing with climate change. Will only happen, we'll only be able to deal with climate change is if we really join political organizations and get involved in mass movements to not only change the United States government and the United States society, but also force the United States government to form agreements with China and other large carbon dioxide emitting countries. So these are his messages of 160 years ago, and they're still really the same messages that we really need to do to deal with almost any large social issue, but particularly issues of climate change. And what I felt that I needed to do after doing all this research was to sort of write a popular book about climate change, which is called Walden Warming, Climate Change Comes to Thoreau's Woods. And my goal was to try to sort of take what I had learned and to spread the message as widely as possible to American society. So with that, I quit, and thank you very much for your attention.